afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the next AI at Melbourne colloquium. It's really nice to see you here, to welcome our invited speaker today. I'd like to quickly just acknowledge the traditional owners or custodians of the land. I find it hard to actually link them to this current theme or topic. Maybe it's easy for you, I don't know. But I want to mention that yesterday we had a Future of event here, a Future of Ownership. And we had a very interesting invited speaker from Tasmania, Professor Maggie Walter, who is Indigenous, who reminded us about the problems of how people who have a notion of what ownership is and how they are the stewards of a country feel when some other culture comes in and just takes that country, whether it's North America, Canada, or Australia. So it's always a good idea to remember the people who were here before and have been doing things for a long time, and just to reflect on when you're in a space that you also remember them, even though none of us took anybody's land, and it's not that we're guilty of that. It's just worth remembering something. So I would like to pay my respects and my remembrances to them as well today. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of AI colloquia coming up now. Next week we have Lucy Liu, one of the founders of Airwallex, the little company that came out from here that's now on the stock market in New York. She's going to tell us in a fireside chat what it felt like to take a company from a few coffees here in the University of Melbourne to something where the CEO now lives in New York and they're on the stock market. It's a big company. You might find it very interesting. That's next week. We have then soon after somebody from UWA coming to tell us about their work on biomedical AI with a lot of records. We're going to work with him to run a hackathon in September. Then there's somebody else coming from UQ. There's Helen Fraser. There's one of the people who originated Netscape. She's coming in 2 months' time, and she's going to tell us about their attempts to use AI in Netscape as Netscape was built out to one of the big browsers. So there's a lot of interesting things coming. Please look out for the announcements. If you're not yet on the mailing list, speak to Janelle as you walk out, and she'll put you on. It would be very nice to see you here again. Welcome, and welcome to our speaker.
Okay. So, I've been asked to do the introductions. Though most of you will have know of Stephan Lewandowski's work. So Stephan is a professor of cognitive science at the University of Bristol. He is widely recognized for his work on the interaction between online information systems, human cognition, and their implications for democracy, a particularly hot topic. His research focuses on misinformation, including fake news, conspiracy theories, and how social media platforms and algorithms shape their spread. He also examines why people accept or reject scientific evidence, including in areas such as climate change and vaccination. He is very well published, more than 200 peer-reviewed articles in lots of leading journals. We all know that. He was recognized as a highly cited researcher by Clarivate from 2022 to 2025, and that honor is awarded to only 0.1% of researchers worldwide, so that's incredible. Numerous prestigious awards: Australian Research Council Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award, a Royal Society Wilson Research Merit Fellowship. He is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK, where he is based, and the Association for Psychological Science, and a member of the German National Academy of Sciences. I'm going to say this wrong, Leopoldina. Thank you. Beyond academia, he has contributed extensively to public and policy discussions, including work that has helped shape the European Union digital legislation on technology and democracy, which Australia is thinking of potentially copying, but I don't know if we've got that far yet in our thinking. His talk is titled "The Power of Political Speech from Persuasion to Action." Please join me in welcoming Stephan.
Thanks. It's great to be back in Melbourne. And I should start out my remarks, if I can. Hello. Hello. Uh-huh. Now it's hyperactive. Okay, let's go back. Back. Okay. We have, where should I be pointing this thing? It doesn't seem to work terribly well. Anyway, I want to start, I'll try it. and if necessary, I'll give this thing a kick. It's great to be back in Melbourne. I'm the speaker today, but I'm actually representing a large international team. All of those people here, plus some others, have contributed to the work I'm reporting today. And the context for my work is shown here, which is that we seem to be living in a time where every week gives us another decade of history. You know, I wake up every morning, I pull my phone out, thinking, oh my God, what's he done overnight? You have a look, Iran, very clever. So there's something new that happens every day. And the trend I'm concerned with is democratic backsliding. What I'm showing you here are data for various different countries that have had episodes of backsliding. And if you justify them to the time of origin, then you can see that what's happening in the United States right now as we speak is unprecedented in terms of the speed of democratic backsliding as measured by a number of different institutes with different indicators, but they all come to the same conclusion. And not only is there a dismantling of democracy, there's also very rapid shifts in public opinion. This is just one little snippet. It is showing the number of people in the US broken down by party who think of the EU as an enemy or as being unfriendly. Now, Democrats don't, but among Republicans since the last year, since Trump took office again, there's been a rapid rise of antagonism towards the European Union. I could also show you a similar graph that's even more extreme with the public opinion in Denmark about the United States. And you can guess why that might happen. And this is all accompanied by other concerning outcomes. For example, hate crimes in the United States have doubled during that time period, and I don't think that trend has abated. So we're living in interesting times where there's a lot of stuff to explain if you're a political scientist or a cognitive scientist with an interest in these matters. So the question is why? Why does this happen? Well, you can't answer that question in 45 minutes, but what I can do is I can approach it through one particular lens, and that's the lens that I think Hannah Arendt identified in the 1950s, talking about 20th century totalitarianism. She was one of the foremost philosophers who analyzed the Nazis and Stalin, and one of her key insights, I think, was that the problem with people lying to you all the time, politicians, is not that you believe the lies. I wish people believed the lies. It's worse than that right now. People don't believe anything because they're being lied to so much. And as Hannah Arendt was saying, with such a people you can do as you please because they're deprived of their capacity to think. Now, how do I know that this applies today, 70 years later? Well, I don't really, but there are some indications that give me cause for concern. For example, not just the fact that Donald Trump, to pick one example, made more than 30,000 false or misleading claims during his first presidency. I mean, that's sort of concerning, I guess. But even more so, perhaps, the accompanying fact that throughout that period, about 3/4, give or take, across the 4 years, of his voters considered Trump to be honest. And that phenomenon triggered my curiosity and my concern with the question, well, what is honesty or truth? What's going on here? A serial liar is considered honest. How can that happen? Well, if you look at the philosophy literature, the historical literature, then what you find is that people who have addressed this issue have consistently identified two components to honesty or truth. There's always something about evidence, veracity, the real world. But then there's also always something about intuition, feelings, and sincerity. And in particular, when you look at the history of 20th century fascism, Nazi writers were very explicit in their rejection of evidence as a matter to adjudicate between the different states of the world. On the contrary, for them, the only thing that matters is this sort of feeling about the folk and how they feel. And if they don't know how to feel, the Führer will tell them. And that's another citation, how in fascism, truth is a personal experience. It's all about feeling. And of course, the moment you get to feeling and intuition, it's kind of like, well, okay, you're not too far away from the possibility that somebody who's serially inaccurate can be considered honest. And indeed, at least anecdotally for starters, if you look at utterances of politicians during the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years, I would say, there's an increasing prominence of things such as this. Truth isn't truth. Giuliani said this on national TV in the US. What he meant by that is, well, everybody, what he really meant, he didn't say that, but what I'm translating him, what he really meant is anybody can believe whatever they want because there's no accountability. Okay? And that, of course, is a very desirable state of affairs if you have a lot of power and you don't care about democracy. And these other two individuals are British right-wing personalities that expressed a similar sort of disdain for facts. Oh, we don't know what a fact is. Fact is antiquated. We've moved beyond that. We're really cool and contemporary. There are no facts. And I would argue that one attribute of Donald Trump's rhetoric that I think is underappreciated is his authenticity and sincerity. Now, there's never any doubt how Donald Trump feels in the moment when he is tweeting something or typing something on Truth Social or whatever it's called. You know how he feels. When he says, "Little rocket man, my button is bigger than yours," as he did during the North Korean little fiasco, and he was talking about the North Korean dictator, you know how he felt. That's authentic. That is sincere. That is an insight into his psyche or whatever it is. And that might well be taken as a sign of honesty. Okay, so this is sort of the theoretical space and the conundrum that I have been trying to address for the last several years. And the particular question that has guided my research is, how does this relate to democracy? And that's the question I want to pursue and perhaps answer in part today. How? Well, our approach has been computational. We consider political rhetoric, be it speeches in Congress or tweets by politicians, speeches in Parliament, just anything political that we know is political and we can analyze it. And what we're trying to do is to capture the underlying notion of truth. That is, how does the speaker think of truth? Do they think it's intuition-based or evidence-based? Is intuition a valid path to understanding the world, or do I need evidence? That is what we're interested in, and if we can identify that, then in our next step, we're going to relate this rhetoric to indicators of democratic well-being. So the question really is, do words matter in a general sense beyond their narrow meaning in a context? And for starters, I'm going to show you how we did this by looking at 6 parliaments around the world. What we do is to look at speeches, irrespective of who's doing the speaking, inside parliaments in these different countries. I'll show you in a moment who they are, over time. And we're analyzing the speech with respect to 2 dictionaries. 2 dictionaries. Okay. Aha. You were telling me it was my computer that made it flicker, but okay. Wrong slide. I want to go back. I push back. Hello. Okay. It's gone, it's not doing what I'm asking it to do. No. Oh, now it's going back. Okay, don't touch anything. This is where I want to be for now. For 10 seconds, I want to be here. So the way we do this is by creating dictionaries that are capturing, in our opinion, what it means to use evidence-based language on the left versus intuition-based language on the right. Now remember, I'm concerned with two tacit ideas about what truth means, what honesty means, the principle underlying truth and honesty. So whenever people use words like that, on the left or on the right, I believe, for good reason, as I'll tell you in a moment, that I can infer what approach to truth they are tacitly taking. Now, we don't actually just count dictionary words in the text. What we do instead is to use something known as a distributed dictionary approach, where we convert these words into mathematical representations, I'll explain that in a moment, that capture the meaning of those words based on co-occurrence information in natural language. This is a mouthful, and if you're not into NPL, don't worry, I'll explain this in a moment, sort of, how we go about doing that. But the important thing is that we're not just counting words, we are considering co-occur. I'll keep this just in case. But yes, let's see. Oh yeah, it even vibrates. Great. So we convert the words to what we call embeddings. Embeddings are a series of numbers that capture the meaning of words. Okay, now let me explain this with a little bit more detail, not the full math, but just a little bit of an idea. On the left, we have our words that went with evidence. On the right, we have words that go with feeling. And again, I'll show you how we know that that's actually true. So now we do some mathematical magic. And the magic is, boom, take the words, turn them into numbers. A profile of seemingly random numbers, 800 or so. And then, because we now have vectors, we can average these numbers, and bingo, we have a single representation of each dictionary. We have an average embedding of the dictionary words and their definitions. We call that one the evidence-based dictionary, the other one for intuition dictionary sub-I. Okay, great. Why would I want to do that? Well, I want to do this because I now take political speech, whatever it is we're looking at, and we're doing exactly the same thing. Create embeddings, mathematical magic, wizardry, average the whole thing, out pops some meaningless, seemingly meaningless string of numbers. But it's not meaningless. It turns out that if we compute the similarity between each dictionary and the speech in question, we get an index of how much that language is using evidence versus intuition. The index we use is a cosine, if you want to be geeky about it, but if not, it's just a number that gives us similarity. We can then take those numbers and subtract one from the other. We subtract the intuition score from the evidence score to get something we call EMI, or evidence minus intuition. And that single number is going to be important from here on. I'm only going to have to tell you two things about this. If it's positive, the speech is evidence-based. If it's negative, it's intuition-based. Okay? More or less depending on the magnitude of that number. And you'll see in a moment that that number is quite useful. And because it's 2026, we also have some LLMs happening here. But yeah, no, I'm not going to explain that. It's too complicated for the moment. So, finally, now that you know kind of what we're doing here, how do I know these dictionaries actually pick up stuff? Well, here are two examples. This is from a speech given in the United States Congress, probably in the late 19th century, and it goes like this. Is it not true that the only basis of valuation that can be established for a fixed rate of return is through the property investment account? I give up. Now, is this evidence-based or intuition-based? Well, I think pretty evidence-based, isn't it? It's so boring, it has to be. And this, on the other hand, oh yes, your howl about the farmers of the country and the destruction of the price of wheat is nothing but the wail of the old stand patter. That's not evidence-based, is it? It's intuition-based. And indeed, these are two prime examples of speech that our dictionaries identify as having a large positive or large negative value of this EMI. And notice how none of our dictionary words actually appear in the text, because this analysis captures the meaning of the text without counting words that have to occur. And this is what's so cool about it. Now, how do we know that our dictionaries do stuff that's meaningful? Well, we know that by getting participants, 156 participants, to look at text and rate the text on how evidence-based and intuition-based it is. And bingo, it turns out that people and the machine do the same thing. They do that pretty well. That number at the bottom there, 0.79, translates to pretty damn good. Okay, the overlap between humans and the machine. We also analyzed 150,000 or so articles in the New York Times, and we found that the science section has higher EMI scores than the opinion section, and the opinion section is more intuition-based, etc. So there's a lot of validation going on here telling us that these dictionaries pick up stuff that is relevant. Here are the 6 parliaments I promised you that we're looking at: US, Italy, Germany, Iceland, Turkey, and Poland. If you wonder why Iceland, well, it's the oldest functioning democracy in the world, so it's got a lot going for it, in addition to volcanoes. So that was one reason of choosing Iceland. The others were chosen because of their different degrees and varieties of democracy. Now, I'm not going to show you all of them in detail, but I'll focus on what we discover when we take 15 millions of speeches in those parliaments, obviously translated and all that. That's why we need the LLMs in the background. And we map out their EMI score. And then we look at a measure of democracy. Well, it turns out there's a number of those. The one that we use is known as the DDI, or Deliberative Democracy Index. It's published by one of the leading institutions in the world that is dedicated to studying the welfare of democracy. And what it does is to, of course, look at electoral integrity, free elections and all that, but also combining that with other things such as freedoms of association and expressions, the way to, the extent to which public debate is dedicated to the public good, and so on. And that's a pretty good number that tells us how democratic a country is between 0 and 1. And importantly, this differs considerably between our 6 countries and also within each country over time. Let's start out with one interesting country, Turkey. The red line here and then subsequent graphs is the state of democracy. If you're looking at this now, it's not looking too good in Turkey. That number 0.1 is damn close to 0. But it wasn't always like that. In the early 2000s, it was at 0.5, which isn't great, but, it's a reasonably democratic. The blue line is the EMI score of all speeches in the Turkish parliament throughout that time period. And that's on the left axis, and anything below 0 means intuition-based, everything above means evidence-based. And what you can see is that the 2 time series are associated. In fact, the number there tells you that it is highly associated. Now, let me trace out a couple of interesting events that happened along the way. There was a military coup in Turkey in 1980, which led to the disruption of democracy for 3 years. They then had elections in 1983, kind of. They were crawling out of whatever they had after the coup to a full democracy by 1989. Now, those labels are attached based on the literature on, Turkish democracy, and I'm hoping that there's some agreement on those labels. In 1997, things took a turn for the worse through what they called a postmodern coup, which means that there was a coup, but the soldiers stayed in their barracks. It was very performative and very postmodernist. It wasn't actually with a lot of guns, but somebody said there's a coup. Oh my God, and then there was a coup. It's a weird sort of thing, but that's what happened. Then things got worse. They got particularly bad after Erdogan was elected in 2014, who's been running Turkey ever since, and who became very authoritarian after a failed coup attempt against him in 2016. So those are just little snippets of history superimposed on this overall trend, which is an association between rhetoric and democracy. Evidence-based rhetoric goes with more democracy. Intuition-based rhetoric in parliament goes with less democracy. And the same pattern we observe in Poland. Now, Poland is a very interesting case because they transitioned from communism to democracy at the end of 1989. They did extremely well for like 20 years until in about 2014, 2015, a Law and Justice party wins the election. Now, even if you know nothing about Poland, the name Law and Justice is enough to make me think, what are these people? Well, you can tell. There are people who engaged in vicious democratic backsliding. The red line goes down dramatically, and with it does the rhetoric in parliament. And then they lose an election to Donald Tusk, who used to be an EU politician, is now Prime Minister of Poland, and who has made it a point to turn this around and restore democracy with some success, as shown here. But again, you have the two lines tracing each other, tracking each other well. And if you look at the overall pattern for all 6 of our countries, then you find that irrespective of the level of democracy, irrespective of whether you're in Turkey at the bottom or Germany at the very top of the DDI score, wherever you are, there is an association, statistically significant association between political rhetoric and the health of democracy. Now, this doesn't tell us much about why specifically this is happening. It's an interesting association, perhaps, but it doesn't tell us the details. So let me give you some details based on a separate in-depth analysis of speeches in the US Congress that actually goes much further back in time to 1879 and looks only at Congress, and then is relating the EMI that I've already explained, the evidence minus intuition score, to these 3 indicators of the health of democracy. The productivity of Congress itself, the polarization in Congress, and at the level of society, the level of inequality in society. Now, inequality is a good proxy for welfare of a society because greater inequality is associated with a large number of indicator variables pointing to a society that is less healthy than societies that are less unequal. There's no question about this. This is decades of empirical research. So, what did Congress do? This is the long-term trend, the EMI score. Again, note the 0 line. We cross over from a maximally evidence-based rhetoric in the mid-1970s to one that is increasingly intuition-based to the present time. That trend is extremely strong. I'm now just focusing in on the last point. For social data, this is an amazingly strong trend. There's a slide from evidence to intuition. You can see on the right that it is bipartisan for the most part, except the last few years where it's Republicans in particular that are exacerbating or accelerating this trend towards intuition-based language. Okay, all right, we already know that that's not so good for democracy. What about the details? Well, how about congressional performance? Now, the political scientists have worked this out. You can give a scorecard to Congress based on these various indicators, whatever they're called. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. But, you know, some Congresses are good, others not so good. And what you see here in those two graphs is the association between the EMI score and productivity in Congress. And the greater the EMI score, the higher productivity. Congress works better if they have debates that draw on evidence rather than intuition. They draw on intuition, well, they don't do very much. And it's not just productivity, it's also polarization. This is, again, the EMI score on the x-axis, plotted against polarization in Congress, not in the population at large, although the two are very highly correlated, but polarization in Congress as measured through co-voting patterns. The more bipartisanship, the lower the polarization. And I'm also drawing in the years of when this is happening. And what you can see is perhaps not surprising. Polarization in the 1960s, 1970s was the lowest it's ever been. That went with evidence-based language. Polarization in recent years, top left quadrant, this is recent times, last 10 years or so. Polarization is greatest, and debate is most intuition-based and least evidence-based. So polarization seems to be associated with reliance on intuition. And this third graph is again relating EMI scores to something else. But this time the outcome variable is society at large. It is inequality, namely the share of income earned by the top 1% in society. And what you can see here, again, is a temporal trend. You start out in the middle of the graph right after World War II. Debate becomes more evidence-based. Inequality goes down until the mid-1970s. Then we have a great reversal. Ronald Reagan, 1981, less evidence-based, more inequality. Goes up and up and up and up, and now we're in the present. Very high inequality, and as I've said multiple times, very low evidence-based discussion. Now here's one other thing about this graph that's really interesting. That's in the footnote, in the caption. And that is that this is lagged by one session of Congress. What does that mean? That means that what I'm showing you here is the debate in Congress, not at the time when I'm measuring inequality, but 3 years before that. That is when the association is maximal. What does that tell us? Well, what that tells us is that there is a possibility of this even being a causal relationship. Why? Well, because the laws Congress passes take 3 years to have an effect on inequality. So, and we already know that Congress is passing more laws when it's more evidence-based. So it's a plausible story to say, well, actually, inequality in society is related to, causally related, a downstream consequence of the way politicians consider truth when they speak to each other in Congress. Speculative, but at least it's consistent with that pattern. Okay, so much for the big picture politics, rhetoric, and political spaces. What about the public? What about, in particular, those who consider Donald Trump to be honest? How does this fit in here? Well, there's a paper that just came out a few weeks ago where Kia Hatunen and I looked at the tolerance of citizens for the violations of democratic norms by politicians. What we did in the experiment was a number of things, and I'll get back to the study later on. For now, I just want to tell you that in one condition, we asked people explicitly, think of honesty as reflecting sincerity, intuition, authenticity. Never mind evidence. Honesty is only whether somebody is reporting what they really feel. And when we do that, and we then present people with a scenario in a fictitious country about a fictitious government that is sidestepping the usual checks and balances, in other words, a government that is violating democratic norms, what we find is that on a subsequent query for how tolerant people are about these norm violations. We find that people become tolerant of norm violations when they consider sincerity as a marker of honesty. In other words, if Donald Trump can say, I'm honest, even though he's not, or at least we know he's wrong all the time. If they can convince, if a politician can convince people of their sincerity as a marker of honesty, they can get away with a lot more. People, the public, tolerates norm violations when they think that it's okay to lie provided you're sincere about it. Bit of a problem. I'll return to the study later on. Now, this is a brief intermittent summary of what we've done. The welfare of democracy is associated with the extent of evidence-based debate. If there's anything, this is my take-home message. The nature of debate matters, and it matters to the quality of politics and to the public's tolerance of democratic backsliding. Now I want to shift gears a little bit, but stay in the same space. I now want to say, oh, okay, well, politics and parliament is one thing, but what about political violence? There is a lot of increasing political violence out there, and there's a lot of speculation in the media and elsewhere that hateful rhetoric somehow has something to do with that. Does it? It's actually not quite that obvious. So what I want to do now is tell you about a current study, a project sponsored by Google, by the way. I have to declare funding here, where we looked at the path from rhetoric to violence. And we did this at two levels. The first level is that we look at rhetorical predictors that are potentially indicative of violence. Now, how do I know that rhetoric is connected to violence? This is actually quite tricky. But one way in which I can do this, we did it, and hopefully we got it right, is to look at benchmark texts, namely manifestos, political manifestos or personal manifestos, where we can have a pretty good idea of whether they led to violence or not. Hitler's Mein Kampf, I think we can safely say, led to violence, for example. And if we can then relate these two, we're already establishing a statistical predictability of rhetoric and violent outcomes. That's okay, but it doesn't tell us how this actually happens. So what we additionally want is some theoretically grounded psychological stage that's in there somewhere that links the markers of rhetoric to the violent outcome through a psychological construct. I'm a cognitive scientist, I'm interested in this stuff, so that's why we're adding the second box. And we want to be topic unaware and politically neutral. In the same way that our EMI score is completely politically neutral, we want to have something here that equally is not saying, oh, that's left wing, has to be violence, or, oh, that's right wing, no, that has to be violent. No, we want to avoid topics and content to the extent possible. So how do we do this? Walking through the methodology just quickly. As I already said, we looked at political manifestos over 200 and something years, 35 different countries, so we're not culturally limited in any way. This is a broad base of manifestos. We classified them as violent or benign based on, well, the existing literature. Most of these manifestos are pretty well known. And also some rating here with high inter-rater reliability. To illustrate, the green is something that was not violent, whatever that is, I don't know. Got to be South America, probably some manifesto about South American independence, not violent. Compared to that, the Black Panthers 10-point program, which by many people is considered to have led to violence. So that's to illustrate, that's our ground truth. That's what we're trying to predict. How do we predict it? Well, we make use of the fact that Google, which sponsored us, has already developed a number of classifiers that take rhetoric and identify the presence of rhetoric in text. They were trained before our study started on several large corpora that were annotated by humans. So this is pre-existing stuff. We can make use of those classifiers, and we know a priori that reasoning is relevant for democratic deliberation, but the others are frequently seen as manipulative or deceptive. Moral outrage, it's not really the kind of thing that you think is good for democracy. The one I want to focus on most, because it turns out to be most important, is what we call alienation, which is exclusionary language. It is when you deny a group to be a member of society, or when you take an individual and you classify them as being outside some relevant group, as in this example here. And our first model dealt with that. Before I get to the modeling, briefly, the psychological mediator, I've already mentioned that. What we were interested here is subjective persuasive intent. This is our psychological construct of the extent to which the argument being advanced in text is either deliberative persuasion, what we call strategic persuasion, or manipulation. Now, the difference between the first two and the third one is that the first two are clear in their intent to persuade. No one is hiding their intention. But the last one, the manipulation, is hiding the intent of what the speaker is trying to achieve. And it turns out that you can train human raters with considerable reliability to identify these subjective intents, which is what we did. And this is now very important. We asked them to do this not for the manifestos, but for 6,000 comments taken from political subreddits. Why? Well, because we wanted to see whether a model of persuasive intent might ultimately also predict violent outcomes, even though it is designed and calibrated in completely different text. So if this works, that's great. If it doesn't work, it wouldn't have surprised me at all. But we'll see what happens. Now I'm going to tell you about the models. There are 3 models. All of them take the rhetorical techniques that we can identify from text based on prior work. These are basically feature detectors. You know, it sort of buzzes away and tells us, whoa, there's alienation in this text. But we don't know yet what that means until we model it by trying to predict an outcome. Here's the first model. We have these classifiers on the left, and each one on its own is trying to predict whether a manifesto will be violent or not. This is applied to the manifestos. What we find is big time signal for alienation. And in particular, we find that, again, these numbers, I don't have time to explain what they all mean, so I put in chance in blue, and the numbers in black are the observed data. And as you can see in each case, we far exceed chance performance. The ROC over here, that's my favorite statistic, for some reason 0.86, is damn good, okay? If you don't know the number, trust me, if you do know the number, you'll agree with me. So that was the first model. We can predict violence based on alienation in the text. But that's only statistical. I want to know more. I want to go deeper. I want to know how this relates to psychology. So here's my second model, taking the same predictors, but now applying that to participants' ratings of persuasive intent on the Reddit comments. Has nothing to do with manifestos. Just tell me what persuasive technique is the person using here. Is it deliberative, strategic, or is it manipulative? People can do this. There's high inter-rater reliability. And guess what? We identified 2 factors that are particularly relevant here. Again, alienation. Alienation increases with manipulation intent. That's the bottom left red line. At the same time, reasoning decreases with manipulative intent. Well, that's not terribly surprising. Manipulation doesn't involve deliberation, right? Duh, it tells us that. But conversely, deliberative persuasion is associated with a high degree of reasoning and a low degree of alienation. So here we now have two detectors, feature detectors, buzzing away with great intensity, telling us whether something is deliberative or manipulative. Now, these are only Reddit comments, right? Okay, so now, big step. Can we take that psychology and predict violence in the manifestos by clamping the whites? We've trained this model on the comments. Reddit has nothing to do with violent manifestos. We say, stop it, clamp all the weights into place, and we're now taking each of those outcome variables and through a simple threshold process, which isn't quite as simple, but I don't have time to explain it, we try to convert this into classification of violence in the manifestos, which the model was not trained on, right? So we're trying to say now, okay, if I have a model that identifies the type of persuasion, will this tell me something about completely different text, about how violent it is? Well, and the answer is it does. Again, we have the chance in blue, the results in black, and if you look at the ROC column, they're all pretty damn good in translation into everyday language for each of the three different types of persuasion without further training. Reddit comments tell us something about how a person is trying to be persuasive. And identification of that strategy in the text of manifestos tells us whether or not it might be violent. Alienation leads to violence. Deliberation reduces the chance of violence. So, that gives us some powerful tool about how we might be able to predict whether a text or speaker is prone to violence. All right, now I want to wrap up. I think we started a little late, so I'm going to take myself another 5 or 10. Yeah. I don't want to sort of say, what are we going to do now? We can do stuff. And there's two things I want to talk about as potential countermeasures. Now, the first thing we have to understand is the role of political elites. We've already talked about elites a lot by looking at parliament, speeches in parliament, and how that relates to democracy. The link is even stronger than just through rhetoric. It is also through actions. We published a paper a few years ago where we considered democratic near misses throughout the last 100 years across the world. We found that in each case, democratic backsliding was triggered by elite norm violations. I mentioned already how people tolerate that if they think honesty is sincerity. But also, in all these cases, autocracy was avoided through elite intervention. Elites are crucial. And I now want to talk to you about elites and democratic backsliding in two ways. The first one is about what we call truth contagion. This is looking at, we're back to the EMI score, this is looking at how politicians affect conversations with the public. Now, Twitter is fantastic for that because politicians tweet stuff on Twitter or X or whatever it's called. And they say something, yeah, I'm great, or whatever. And then the public replies. They can do that on Twitter. This is an amazing facility for dialogue. We looked at 10,000 conversations on Twitter between members of Congress and the public. We have the initial tweet, we call that a seed, that is seeding the conversation issued by the politician. We then have the repliers. We only consider the first reply of each person, because otherwise you don't know who they're talking to. But the first reply of a person is to the politician. And we keep it politically balanced and all that. And guess what? We compute the EMI score, or an analog thereof, for the seed and the replies. This is the result. Now, we have Democratic members of Congress on the left, Republican on the right. You can ignore that. The two look the same. There's a steep slope. What does that mean? Well, the steep slope means that the more evidence-based the seed was, so on the right with a positive number, the more the replies from the public are evidence-based. This is contagion. The politician sets the tone. If the politician is evidence-based, so are the replies. If the politician is intuition-based, so are the replies. And if the politician is intuition-based, I'm not showing you this, but I'm telling you, the more polarized are the replies. So the language that we've identified in politics, this tension between evidence and intuition, isn't just for politicians themselves. No, it is contagious and affects how the public responds. Now, the good news is that if you can get people of either party to be on the right in this space, then public discourse is going to improve dramatically, right? Yeah, so you got to get the elites to go over there. How do you do that? Well, I don't know, but I'll show you in a moment. Another footnote to this, in case you're geeky and wondering about correlation versus causation and homophily and all sorts of alternatives. If you're a reviewer 3, this is the answer to that. The same pattern holds in an experiment where we have full control. So we're pretty confident that this truth contagion is real. And if you can get elites to restore evidence-based discourse, well, at least they're not going to encounter opposition from the public, because the public is quite happily responding in kind. That's nice. But how do you get the elites to do that? Well, I have no idea. If I knew, I would be, whatever, prime minister of something and fix the world. But, you know, I'm still here talking. Well, let me tell you about the study I mentioned briefly earlier, where we oriented people towards thinking of honesty as reflecting sincerity and intuition. What I didn't tell you when I first introduced the study is that we also had another condition, where we asked people the opposite. We said, think of honesty as requiring accuracy in evidence. Sincerity is not enough. So we oriented people one way or the other. And we can now look at the difference in the public's tolerance for norm violations by politicians as a function of this orientation. And what I'm summarizing here on the right are 4 experiments where we got people's agreement with norm violations for incitement. If a politician says, go and storm Capitol Hill, that's violating a democratic norm against incitement. We get people's endorsement for that. We get people's endorsement for serial dishonesty and for attempts to expand power by ignoring Congress or disobeying courts. The triangles, if there are triangles, that means there's a significant effect. The darker the shading, the greater the effect size. And in all cases but one, there's a significant difference favoring the intuition orienting over accuracy. Now, when I say favoring, I mean greater tolerance for norm violations. So having more for intuition is not a good thing. That's more tolerance for norm violation. But when you tell people that accuracy is important, they become less tolerant of norm violations. People defend democracy, at least in their tick box responses to items, when they consider accuracy, typo, as a required marker of honesty. And that's why I think it is so important not to yield ground on this postmodernist specious claim that, oh, you never know what's true. Rubbish. Of course we do. If you made it here by car, you know it's true because you can read the traffic signs. Now, the good thing is that that means people are less likely to electorally reward elites for dishonesty and other norm violations. How do you roll that out at scale? I have no idea. But at least we have an empirical handle, small scale, that reinforces the importance of accuracy and fact-based discourse to democracy, which is precisely what Hannah Arendt told us about 50 years ago. So, words matter. They matter in politics a great deal. They even predict political violence. And if you want to do something about political backsliding, well, elite leadership is an obvious way to go. And how do you hold elites accountable? Well, I don't know, but one thing I do know is that the public is less tolerant of norm violations by politicians if they understand the importance of accuracy. And one more slide and a QR code. What I want to leave you with there is a whole bunch of public-facing resources, including a report that I just co-led for the European Commission. This came out 2 weeks ago, that is summarizing the literature. I shouldn't say the entire literature, but it feels like we read everything. The literature between democracy, online technology, algorithms, misinformation, and all that kind of stuff. And on the left, the anti-autocracy handbook is self-explanatory as a guide for scholars to navigate democratic backsliding. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions if there's time. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, Serafina. Sure. Yes, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you very much. So my first question is this LLM component.
In the Parliament study,
yes, yes, and especially whether you also compared, like whether you used the LLM, for example, to cross-validate the dictionary and embeds. Because I could see, like based from what I do, most of the time it performs quite well, especially in such context. So I would be interested in that. And the second question is more theoretically, like I think your measure of evidence or intuition-based political speech, I think that's very face valid. And my hunch is it also correlates, for example, with our measure of illiberal.
It well might, yeah.
But like I was wondering about counter speech, because you look at speeches in parliaments in general, and is there something happening such as counter speech? And if so, is that different in different kinds of democracies? So for example, in Germany, I would expect maybe more counter speech than in Turkey, for example, depending on the time. But like, is that something you were able to capture? And if not, or if not to a large extent, does intuition-based language then diffuse? And if so, how?
Yeah, okay. Interesting questions. The first one, I'm going to be very brief. Basically, the main role of the LLM was to deal with the translation angle across the 6 different languages. And we blended the LLM output with our own distributed dictionary representation. We found that worked best. So it was, the details are in the paper, but that's sort of just a snapshot of what happened there. The second question, yes, very interesting. How does counter-speech feature into this? Well, it doesn't, because we didn't analyze for that. What we found, we looked at, we obviously looked at this in some detail. We tried to identify partisan streams. And as you could see in the graph for the US Congress, there wasn't much of a partisan difference, which did surprise us. When it comes to tweets, there is a partisan difference. I didn't show you the data, but it's published. And Democrats tend to be more evidence-oriented than Republicans on Twitter, but not in Congress. The other thing we observed is that it depends also a little bit on whose party is in power. And a party in power, I hope I get this right. There's two possible outcomes, and if I get it right, I'm right. Otherwise, it's the other way around. But the party in power becomes more evidence-based. The party in opposition is more intuition-based in their speech. It's a small effect, but it's pretty systematic. You can try, Biden, you know, Democrats up here, whoops, Trump goes down. It's pretty symmetrical for both parties. But that's the only hint of counter-speech that I have in there. It's a very interesting question, and we haven't looked at that. We looked at topics, and with the exception of international relations, the trend in Congress is virtually identical for all topics, whether it's gun control, abortion, whatever, which surprised us. We thought that hot button stuff would look different. It doesn't. The temporal trend is the same across all topics. So it seems to be something much more fundamental than a particular topic or your position on that topic. And the same is true for the contagion stuff. In our experiment on the contagion, we used pro and con in different topics when we manipulated the extent to which the tweet was evidence-based or intuition-based. Same effect across all cells of that design. It seems to be transcending those things as a first approximation. Andy?
Yeah, so this leads very well into what I was going to ask, which is thinking about the EMI trends, why? And
right.
What I was wondering, you know, like what are the selection pressures on this?
Right.
And so I was really wondering, like,
Yes.
it's hard to say, but in your data there are things like, are people with higher EMI, do they get more engagement, or lower EMI, more engagement on Twitter, or what? How does it, you know, track their electoral success or their popularity? Have you looked at anything like that?
Yes, I can tell you. Well, let me work backwards through the question. There's no correlation between the amount of belief speaking or whatever intuition-based language and electoral success. We looked at that at the level of state districts, and nothing. So there's no electoral penalty, at least, to be paid for highly intuitive language. We also looked at it by state. Not a terribly clear pattern. There's a little bit. The red states tend to be more intuition-based than the blue states, but actually, you know, it's not that clear. There are some red states that are up on top and some blue states down there. Figure, Hawaii, what are you guys doing? You know, it's that sort of thing, not very clear. But the most interesting part of your question is why? Why did this happen? Well, I don't know, but I have I can still answer it with two possibilities. The first one is Ronald Reagan. What Ronald Reagan did was a lot of things, and he was revolutionary in his own right. One of the things he did was to introduce this whole populist-leaning, slightly folksy style into politics. You know, I'm a real man, I chop wood in a checkered shirt. That sort of thing, that was Ronald Reagan's trademark. And that is already moving away from dry language. I read out the evidence-based speech from the 19th century. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, I didn't want to finish reading it because it's so boring. And so Reagan, I think, shifted away from that, number one. Number two, the other thing Reagan did was to abolish the fairness doctrine. And the moment he did that, the shock jocks emerged. And public conversation, if you can call it that, became suffused with outrage and all sorts of other stuff. Now that is probably a trigger point for politicians to jump onto that bandwagon. Now that's accelerated by another development, which I think is probably more important, and that is technology. Now, in the 1970s, up through the 1970s, Americans had the choice between NBC, CBS, and ABC. Well, and NPR if you were really smart. And that's it. There was nothing else. No cable. So all the politicians were channeling everything they said through the same 4 gatekeepers, 4 channels for the whole country. That forced everybody to compete somewhere in the middle, because everybody was watching those channels. Now, the moment you had cable, the moment you had deregulation, the moment you no longer had a fairness doctrine, the moment you had shock jocks, it became possible for politicians to address their own margins selectively. And that creates an incentive for extremism, because they gain more votes on the extremes than they lose in the middle if you can talk to my extremes selectively. And that is what we're politicians increasingly able to do from the 1970s onward. There's a paper by Glaser et al. With a mathematical model that is showing this, and it explains all sorts of rhetorical behavior by politicians, and it is that extremism became rewarded. So I think that is, those two factors combined, that's my explanation. But it's not based on causal evidence or anything. I think
I got the mic. You kind of partially answered my question already, but I was wondering, because you're implying this causal link between the quality of rhetoric, right, and the democratic backsliding 3 years afterwards, right?
Yeah.
It's maybe not causal link, but you're applying this connection, and you have this temporal shift to support that. But I'm also wondering that the quality of rhetoric itself is a sign of the state of democracy at that time.
Yes.
Right, so people don't just randomly start to appeal to intuition and be very emotional as a species. It's just the quality of people being selected to the Senate, right?
Absolutely, it could, yes.
And the overall vibe of the Senate.
Yeah.
And the general public at that moment,
Yes, I think you're right. I think it's a selection artifact that people who become more extreme are becoming more attractive. It's this whole issue of the primaries, how that fosters radicalism, because the primaries depends on the state, but in most states are within a party. You have to be a Republican to vote in the Republican primary. And the moment you do that, you're selecting candidates for the general election that are from a restricted, already extreme sample of the population. And within that sample, the extremism may be advantageous. And that's why the primaries are maybe not necessarily the best way to select candidates, even though it sounds really democratic. The same, by the way, is holding right now, is affecting the UK, in my opinion, because party leaders are no longer chosen by their MPs, but by party members. And party members tend to choose extreme candidates because they're pure, a real conservative. So you have a tiny number of highly selected individuals voting for the leader of the party, and in some cases the next government. This happened in the UK recently when the Tories were in power, and they rotated through prime ministers, and every time they kind of kicked one out and got the next one out of the closet, there were 300,000 people, members of the Conservative Party, who voted on that leader, and that person became prime minister. So we had the spectacle of a non-election where people debated each other on TV for the benefit of 300,000 people who made the decision. A grotesque sort of perversion of democracy. But of course, when people started doing that, they thought that's really democratic. Let's get the party membership to vote, not just the MPs. But then all of a sudden you have these weird outcomes and I think that's all these processes are contributing to that acceleration. I think the gentleman there, you got the mic.
Stephan, just a very speculative thought here, but so I know it's been debunked, but there is this Myers-Briggs index where you have people they have preference for thinking and preference for feeling, and to me, those two groups of words and the balances seem to reflect those exactly, and sort of how you would word some thoughts of your own might be more using the words from one bucket or the other. So I'm wondering to what extent does what you're measuring there portray changes and shifts in the overall population as well, in terms of preferences, or whether people shape those preferences? I don't know to what extent these kind of characteristics can be innate, or whether they are part of education and the education system and stuff we're exposed to, right?
Yeah.
But there is change over time, and whether this is different by populations.
No, interesting question. I get your question totally. I think it's a very good point. And what I didn't have time to explain is that in one of our studies on the orienting, where we tell people to be one or the other. We also looked at their pre-existing epistemic preferences. And as you say, people have epistemic preferences. And we can measure that. We have an instrument developed to measure that, which we validated in 5 different countries, including Hungary, and so we're pretty sure it's a good measurement tool. And we showed that that acts as you would expect. So people who are more intuitive are more tolerant of norm violations. People who are less intuitive are less tolerant of that as a personal predisposition. That's certainly in there. But the experimental intervention was far more powerful than that, statistically, and it overrode people's epistemic preferences. People's epistemic preferences are real, but I don't think that they're so strong that you can't move them around in a situation with an intervention. So to answer your question about the long-term trend, I don't think that that's necessarily a shift in the population's epistemic preferences. I think there are some people who are, the number of people who are predisposed one way or the other may well stay the same, but there are these overriding interventions like listening to Fox News or listening to MSNBC or whatever that'll trigger or nudge you towards one or the other. I think they're more important than personal predisposition. Interesting question. Oh, well, not across the different countries we looked at for that study, which was US, UK, Germany, Hungary, Spain. Not terribly confident here because I don't recall but something like that. A number of European countries, mainly EU and the US. And now it's not dramatically different. People don't differ dramatically. Yeah. Oh, you need a mic. There's a lady coming with a mic.
Great, thank you. I wonder if this difference in style of speech is also performative. In a sense, you have the data from parliaments. Could you isolate, for instance, the speeches that are done at the floor and committees that are not televised, and then perhaps isolate if it's performative or not, and also among coalition members versus coalition versus opposition, and then also you can see if I'm going to be confrontational, I can use more intuitive.
Yeah, very good point. We haven't looked at committees, certainly not in the Congress. We also haven't looked at coalitions per se. We have looked at parties, and as I mentioned before, there's surprisingly little difference, which did surprise me a great deal. I thought that certain parties, the party of intellectual academics, whatever, if that exists, that they would remain evidence-based no matter what everybody else is doing. But it doesn't seem to be that way. We looked at the European Parliament, which has, of course, lots of different parties that are unique because they are spread across countries. So the parliamentarians are from 27 different countries, but they're in the same parliamentary grouping, so you get very interesting mixes. And there it's a little more complicated, but again, there was nothing that jumps out and says, hey, I'm a big effect. Okay, it's not like the time trend, which you can't overlook. I mean, it's massive. So a lot of the stuff is massive. And all the other things you think should be there kind of, say, oh, you're hiding over there. Oh, be underneath that corner, there's an effect. It's that sort of thing. It's nothing big. Doesn't mean it's not real, but I'm just saying in terms of order of magnitude, it's just not there. A question in the back. Wait for the mic, please.
So you kind of covered earlier that there is this sense that the pressures on politicians are probably a large factor in what causes them to take up, certain ways of speaking, ways of being. On those sort of smaller trends, you might be able to find countries like Australia that have everyone votes. they have to
Yes.
vote. Engagement
Yes.
broadly doesn't change that much over
Yes.
time because it can't in the same way.
That's right.
Do those kind of differences show up? As in,
Yes.
do the pressures on politicians through the actual systems that they're engaged with
Yes.
show up?
Yes, I think they do. Now, we didn't look at the Australian Parliament, but we did look at Australia in the context of a different series of studies, where what we did was to confront our participants with false statements by politicians. And we then corrected those false statements. And we observed the outcome of that on people's preferences for the politician. So we did it in the US with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders wasn't very easy to do because it's hard to find something that he was wrong about, by the way. But we did. He was wrong about a couple of things. And Donald Trump was easy. We had an overflowing inbox of stimuli. And the bottom line is, in the United States, it makes no difference how often a politician lies and how often we tell people that they were wrong. People say, oh, okay, he was wrong. They adjust their belief quite rationally. Makes zero difference to their voting intentions, okay? Now, we ran the same study in Australia. Two things notable. Number one, it was even harder than for Bernie Sanders to find clear false statements uttered by Australian politicians. The worst we came up with is that somebody said, most Australians commute to work for more than an hour. Well, it turns out that's false, okay? So, but that's the type of statement that we were able to pick that was unambiguously false. I forget who that was. Doesn't really matter because they're so, it was a really hard experiment to run. But here's the outcome, the important thing. Australians hate being lied to and adjusted their voting intentions dramatically if we showed them politicians lied to them. They're very sensitive to that. Americans don't give of course they're lying, right? It's completely irrelevant to American political decisions. Australia mattered a great deal. UK, somewhere in the middle, more towards the US. And I agree with you. It's the preferential voting, it's the mandatory voting, it's all sorts of other things that Australia has in its favor. And that's, one good, exactly. Tell me about it. I'm moving back here in 2 years.
And on that happy note, I think we should call time on questions. We've gone over a little bit. I've been instructed to say there is food and possibly drinks. I'm not actually quite sure, but just outside. Good stuff outside. If you have any further questions, maybe find Stephen when he has a drink in his hand. And yes, this would be awesome. So please join me to thank him once again.